Hello, Megan.
Hi, Bart. How are you?
Good. Yeah. All things considered, not bad. Oh, here we go.
Well, it's nice to see you again, and welcome back to Digital Hammurabi. Dr. Ehrman is here to promote his most recent course, which is called Finding Moses. And I am assuming that it's not just about whether Moses was an historical figure.
No, I think maybe 8 lectures would be overkill on that. but but it's going to be dealing with the historicity of Moses, but also the historicity of the traditions about him in the Pentateuch, which, as you know, is 4/5 of the Pentateuch, and so it's dealing with historical and literary issues in the stories about Moses.
Excellent. So, will you be going into detail with all of the books, or are you focusing on one or two in particular?
I'm going to cover all of them to some extent. So the deal is this. This is part of a broader series that I'm doing on my courses. That is how scholars understand the Bible, and the goal of the entire series is to cover the entire Bible and to talk about what scholarship says about it. So I had this earlier course just on Genesis. And I wanted to devote a number of lectures just to Genesis because it's obviously it's such a fundamental book. But in many ways, of course, these others are as well. So I'm going to have this will be 8 lectures, and it'll deal with these 4 books and both the events that happen in them. Most of these books are the Jewish law, and so dealing with what the Jewish law is all about. But you get the Exodus from Egypt, and you get the wandering in the wilderness. You have the beginning of the conquest of Canaan, and so all of those historical things, the giving of the law, I'll be dealing with, as well as trying to explain what's going on in these books.
Fantastic. When we are looking at, again, returning to if Moses actually existed, when we're looking at that question, what do you think is general consensus scholarship? Is he considered someone who did exist, but the stories we have about him are drastically blown out of proportion? Or is it more that he was completely ahistorical?
I think I think it really depends which scholars you talk to, and I've found over the years that it's complicated to say what the majority of scholars say, because whenever I say that, people point out actually there are a lot of fundamentalist scholars. There are a lot of evangelical scholars, and you're just picking which scholars. And so I would say among historical scholars, most historical scholars don't think that events like the Exodus happened in the way it's
Mm-hmm.
described, or the giving of the law. That these are very, very large exaggerations of what happened. Many scholars do think that there was some kind of Exodus event, and there had to be some kind of leader. And a lot of people are impressed by the fact that the name Moses is actually not a Hebrew name; it's an Egyptian name. And so coming out of Egypt, and it's interesting because the author of Exodus, who tries to explain the name, explains the name Moses using a Hebrew etymology, which is a false etymology. He says it has to do with because when he's a baby, his mother tries to hide him in this basket, and he's drawn out of the water by the servant of the Pharaoh's daughter, and the Hebrew text tries to explain that that's why he's called this, because the word for drawing out in Hebrew sounds like Moses, and that's actually not it. And so it's actually, so if it's an Egyptian name, it's like all these stories. So I think a lot of scholars think there's probably something back there. I tend to be on the more skeptical side myself. I think these stories are written hundreds of years later, and I think that there's enough to suggest that probably we're not dealing with a historical figure per se, in a different way from like with Jesus. And with Jesus, there was a Jesus, there was a man Jesus, and so, but so much told about him is legendary. But like I'm not, like I don't think there was really an Abraham or Isaac or Jacob, and I kind of doubt there was a Moses, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm not staking my career on it.
So you brought up briefly the Moses birth kind of story and the floating down the river. How do you see that connecting to the Mesopotamian story of King Sargon, who did something very, sorry, I'm absolutely assuming you know everything I'm talking about. But the story of Sargon, who is sealed in a basket again and floated down the river and found by a priestess.
Yeah, so the idea that this kind of discovery narrative is common throughout ancient mythologies, and you certainly do get this ancient Near Eastern parallel with Sargon that is like remarkably similar. You get this kind of reed basket that he's in, and so and put in to hide him, and he's discovered, so you get these stories, and that's obviously the closest one, which is what you would expect. It's kind of like you get these flood narratives, you get these creation in the ancient Near East. But I will say it's also multicultural because you get, the founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus, they're babies who are kind of they're discovered, and so so you get these kind of miraculous infancy stories about people who are going to be extremely prominent, and it's just a way of doing it. And so I don't think it's original with this part of Exodus.
And in the Mesopotamian birth legend of Sargon, it's commonly assumed that it's one of the ways the king legitimized his rule. His name Sharukin means the king is legitimate, which is like a big neon sign saying I'm absolutely not supposed to be king. So him being chosen effectively by the gods to be king is part of that story. Do you see a similar impetus maybe behind Moses' story? Making him exceptional means that he has always been chosen by Yahweh, maybe?
Yeah, it's a tricky business because in parts of the story, part of the difficulty with the Moses story is that, as with the rest of the Pentateuch, you have different sources that have been used to construct the story, and as a result, you have some tensions. And one of the tensions seems to be, is he really a descendant of Abraham? I mean, because his name is, his name is Egyptian, and he grew up in this family of Pharaoh. And even even in the Bible, I mean, his parents are said to be Levites, but there's something connects him with Midian. Is he a Midianite? As opposed, and so there are these various strands of things that are kind of hard to straighten out. But usually, what happens when you have somebody of questionable origins, you make up stories to try and explain those questionable origins. And again, it's completely cross-cultural. It's what ends up with Jesus as well, by the way, for people interested in the Bible, because there were rumors that Jesus was illegitimate. Oh yeah, well, it wasn't a normal birth. His mother was a virgin, and so you come up with. And so I think it's something kind of like that with Moses. That these stories are being invented in order to authorize somebody that there were some doubts about.
Interesting, thank you. I know that your course is looking at the Pentateuch and the books that are in the Bible. Do we have any extra biblical sources talking about Moses?
No.
Excellent. Easy answers to a question. Thank you.
That's part of the problem, is that for the this part of the Bible is supremely important for understanding the nation of Israel, for understanding Israel's claim to the Promised Land, for understanding the Jewish law. These are absolutely the foundational books. And so the historical question becomes increasingly interesting and pressing for many people. Is this stuff that really happened or not? And one of the curiosities is that the events are never discussed in any external sources. The individuals who are key in the events are never mentioned in individual outside sources. And then you have the question of archaeology. There's no really archaeological evidence for any of these things. And so it becomes a really important question, because if Jewish identity is rooted in these stories, what does that do if the stories are legendary rather than historical? And I'm not giving an answer to that question, but it does seem to be an important question for many people.
As he's such an important figure, does Moses play a part then in the New Testament at all?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, back to Jesus. So the first gospel, Matthew, is actually is really the most interesting in this respect, because Moses, of course, figures throughout, because the Mosaic law is an important issue for Christians. What do we do with this law of Moses? Most of us aren't Jews. We don't have to become Jews. What do we do with this law of Moses? So that part's important. But Moses himself as a figure is very important in the New Testament, especially in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus is born when some other country is controlling the children of Israel. This time it's Rome instead of Egypt. The leader of his country tries to kill him when he's born, Herod versus Pharaoh. He manages to escape, and in this case, Jesus escapes by going to Egypt, by the way. And he comes out of Egypt, and Matthew quotes a passage in Hosea, "Out of Egypt have I called my son," which was a reference originally to the children of Israel at the Exodus. And Jesus immediately goes to when he becomes an adult, he goes into the wilderness for 40 days to be tempted, like Moses and the children of Israel were in the wilderness for 40 years. Then he goes through the water of baptism, like going through the Red Sea. And then he goes up on a mountain and starts giving a sermon, which is like going up to Mount Sinai. It's like and giving the law. And so like Matthew's really all over this. And I would say the others are to some extent, but Matthew kind of goes out of his way for it.
Do you get so we talked about the similarities, do you get any distinctions or contrasts drawn in the New Testament between Jesus and Moses, or are people very much trying to make them not the same person, but like continuity?
Early Christians had to struggle with the connection between Jesus and Moses, and between the gospel of Jesus and the law of Moses. And there were different Christians who had different solutions to it. Matthew, for whom Moses is a bit of a hero, wants to insist that Jesus was completely simpatico with Moses, and that when Jesus gives his law from the Sermon on the Mount, he's not violating the law, and he's not telling his followers to violate the law. He's telling people you have to follow the law of Moses, and this is how you really do it. And so you get that kind of thing. But then you get somebody like Paul, who thinks that the followers of Jesus don't necessarily have to keep, if they're not Jewish already, they shouldn't become Jews. That actually violates, that's to many people, that seems to violate the teachings of Moses in the law, in the Pentateuch, because starting with Abraham before Moses, but starting with Abraham, any foreigner who wants to be among the people of God has to get circumcised. And God says this is an eternal covenant. And so Moses is continuing on with this eternal covenant, that these are the chosen people now, and they're the ones chosen. And if you want to join you're welcome to be a foreigner. And if you're a foreigner, you want to participate in Passover, great. You just got to be circumcised first. And so Paul has to deal with that. So Paul's kind of at odds, but he can't bring himself to say he's against Moses. He can't, because
it's a step too far.
He tries to work it out in his own way.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I think we are just about out of time. Again, the course is Finding Moses. The full price is $53.95, but there is an early bird price of $47.95. There'll be all the information across the bottom of the screen and in the description. And if you use our affiliate link, I greatly appreciate it. It helps us support the channel and keep the lights on and all that good stuff. But thank you again. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.